happened so incredibly quickly. And so that's one of the problems when trying to properly frame what the situation is right now, is that we haven't experienced anything like this before. We had a near shutdown of multiple sectors of our economy. And so the closest proxy in our region is usually the federal shutdowns that we have, but this has gone on for so much longer that, again, it's a little bit different. Now, since we hit our trough in May, we've recovered about 35% of our jobs. Even with this recovery, our job losses right now are twice as large as what they were at the peak of the prior two recessions on this graph. And so if we were to start the pandemic right now and sort of have this level of job losses, we would all still be blown away, because we still haven't experienced anything quite like that. So we have quite a ways to go in fully recovering our jobs, but we are in the recovery track right now. In terms of job losses, the leisure and hospitality sector is driving the declines. And this is across the board nationally, but also locally. And locally, this sector accounts for about half of the absolute decreases in jobs. The sector includes restaurants, accommodations, and entertainment. And it has had the largest percentage decrease. In May, this sector had lost half of its job space. Half of it was gone. And that's just completely unprecedented. As of August, compared to last year, we have lost about 30% of the jobs in this sector, and they're about 35% recovered, just like the rest of the job space overall. And so things are improving. This sector is starting to recover. It's just a very mild recovery compared to the total number of jobs that lost. The second largest absolute decrease was in the professional and business service sector. This is our largest sector. And the job losses here, I'm jumping to the third. I'll keep with the professional business service sector, but the third largest loss. But the losses in this sector are concentrated in administrative and temp jobs primarily. And these jobs will likely come back as workers go back into the office. The second, in absolute terms, the second largest decrease in jobs has been in the education and health service sector. These are in non-hospital healthcare, primarily ambulatory healthcare, nursing homes, a little bit of social services, but things that are typically a little bit more elective. And so they have been more affected by the pandemic than other places. The increase that you see is the federal government. This is a temporary bump primarily from the decennial census workers. So it is not representative of a sort of positive spot. It's just a blip. This will dissipate when the census bump has subsided. So all in all, as of August, we had lost about 200,000 jobs compared to where we were last year. And that's about 6% of our total job space. One of the things that I mentioned is that we were able to send a very large percentage of our workers home. And what that has meant is that 54.4% of all households in the region have at least one worker that is currently teleworking because of the pandemic. This is a significantly larger share than the US overall. And it's also a significantly larger share than the other major metros in the US. And so what the implications of this are twofold. I've already mentioned that it has meant that we've probably been able to preserve our job space better, because our workers are very well suited for working from home on a production standpoint, where what we do, we can send home, and the underlying knowledge services are preserved. The second implication of this, though, is that we will probably have a slower recovery on some of the consumer spending items, because when you are working from home, for example, you don't need to commute, so your transportation dollars will stay low until you're back in the office. You're not going out to lunch necessarily, you're not going to post-work happy hours, and all of those add-on activities that happen with workers. My guess is that those dollars are being saved right now, probably more so than they're being spent in other sectors. So it's not just a transfer. I think it's really a preservation at the moment. And so as long as workers can work from home and that is deemed the most safe choice, that means that our recovery will continue to be kind of slow and sluggish compared to other metros, because we don't have the same impetus for change that they do. I do want to point out that there are extremely large distributional effects of this pandemic, where the households that are higher income are more likely, higher income and better educated, are more likely to be able to work from home. They're also more likely to have a job that hasn't been affected at all by the pandemic. Maybe you don't get your raise this year, but you still have your job. Whereas households on the lower income households and income households that have less education are typically the ones that are most affected. And you can see this slide shows the difference in households that have someone that's teleworking, but you can do a similar slide and look at the households that have lost jobs, lost wages, and it looks very, very similar where the lower income households are most affected. And this is one of the tricks in describing what's happening right now, that the average or the median household has had a very different experience than the households that are most affected, because they tend to be a smaller part of the economy, and so they're not showing up on the average side as much. The second major problem when trying to measure this recession is that usually productivity per job is fairly stable. It changes somewhat incrementally over time, but the pandemic has kind of has created massive changes in productivity that other recessions didn't necessarily do. And the bright spot is in the information sector. This is Zoom, cloud storage, tech services, all the things that you need for your communication software. And on a per job basis, their overall output and economic value add has increased quite a lot, because we're all using a lot more of these services, and they didn't need to ramp up hiring. They could just scale up on the services side. They don't need a one-for-one hire on the labor side. The biggest losers of this pandemic, unsurprisingly, are leisure and hospitality. And at its peak in the Washington region, consumer spending for leisure and hospitality had dropped off by about 75%, but employment had only decreased by about 50%. And so what that suggests is that the workers that stayed on payroll were working far fewer hours, or probably were somewhat what I would consider ghost workers, where they weren't really associated with that job, but they were on payroll because they wanted to preserve healthcare or whatever kinds of benefits were associated with that. And so what that has meant is that the economic losses associated with the leisure and hospitality service were much larger than the job losses. And that's somewhat intuitive if you kind of think about the revenue side. Transportation and warehousing has had the same phenomenon, where they have retained their workers better than they retained revenue and output. And so they've had significant losses. I do also want to point out that professional, scientific, technical, and management services, these are our bread and butter white collar services, at least nationally, had a decrease in productivity per worker in second quarter 2020. Some of this is because we were adjusting to working from home. That is a new adjustment for a lot of us, and we were not as efficient, to put it politely, for several months. It was a lot harder to manage. So some of that decrease may be temporary, but some of it's going to be a little bit more permanent. We're all doing our own admin right now because you don't have the resources that you would in your office. We're all struggling with some tech problems that usually we could call our IT desk and get up on that. But so just to put that into a little bit of perspective, that the job losses usually correspond very well with economic losses, but right now that's not been the case. Thinking forward to housing. I've already talked a little bit about work from home, and I know that there'll be some questions on that later, so I'm going to switch straight to rent, because that is something that is increasingly of concern about the potential for a spike in evictions. And I want to point out that we don't usually track this very well. And so there's been a lot of sort of contextless data that has been driving the headlines. Now, in any given year, in any given month, it appears that as of the 6th of the month, or basically on-time rent payments, only about 80% of renters appear to have gotten rent in on time. And that what happens is that over the course of the month, that gap closes to sort of 95, 98%. And so some of the headlines that are coming out are hyper focused on who's paying rent on time. And so I'm hearing or you're seeing headlines that are in the 20 to 30% aren't paying on time. And that's actually not that unusual. And so the implication of that is not that 20% of renters are going to be evicted, because if that were the case, then 20% of renters would have been evicted last year as well. So that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be spikes in evictions. It just means that it's likely that when you look at how the gap has closed over the course of the month, it's probably more of an order of magnitude of 1 to 2% of renters. That's a very large number of renters. I think that's headline worthy, but it doesn't resonate as much as that 20% headline that you're seeing. But 1 to 2% of renters are at risk of being evicted because of financial reasons, because of the pandemic. Note that this is with the extra stimulus dollars, both nationally and locally. And so that as those dollars run out, that those rates are likely to increase. There is another data set that is from the census that does only ask about on-time rent payments, and the Washington region is parsed apart separately. And in general, the regional trends have tracked with the US trends. The margins of error here are quite large, but in general, it's tracking about the same. And one of the things that this survey asks that other surveys don't, though, that it's very beneficial, is what share of rent was deferred. And about 1 to maybe 3% in any given month was officially deferred in the Washington region. And the deferral rates are highly clustered in lower income households. So that lower income households, those are actually the ones that are most affected by the pandemic. They are also the most likely to have had their rent officially deferred by their landlord or their property manager. And so it does seem like there's been a responsiveness on the landlord side. And a lot of this happened early in the pandemic, very upfront, and that now that their income streams have stabilized, or they have a better understanding of what's going on the income side, the deferral rates seem to have dropped off a little bit, but they're still much larger for lower income households than they are for higher income households. That said, when you look at who is least likely to be paying rent on time, it is still lower income households, even ignoring those that have had their rent deferred. And so when thinking about who is currently at risk for an eviction, it is, in our region, it's probably households that are earning less than $50,000 a year. And it's probably not the 20% order of magnitude that you see on this chart. It's probably much smaller than that, because some of these households are paying their rent later in the month. It's just that they're not paying immediately on time. And so to add a little bit of context there, looking at our owner market has been kind of shockingly resilient. New housing market activity, new listings and new pendings at the peak of the pandemic dropped 35%. That meant that 65% of our general housing market activity was immune to a global pandemic, which is quite remarkable. The 35% drop is large. We've never seen anything like it, but also you weren't able to tour in person. You didn't necessarily, or early in the pandemic in particular, we didn't really know what it was going to look like in the next couple of months. And so that 35% drop it makes sense to me, but it's actually, I had expected something larger. Closed sales decreased for several months during the pandemic, but as of September, they have fully recovered. And for the first 9 months of the year, we are now up about 5% of our compared to 2019, the same period in 2019. And so the pandemic really hasn't seemed to change the long-term trends for housing, at least in aggregate. Nationally, there's been a lot of discussion about what's happening in the city centers. In the home sales markets there are diverging from the regional trends. This chart shows the 12-month moving average of closed sales on a percentage point basis to smooth it out a little bit. And what you can see happened in our region in DC, was that the initial decrease in DC was much steeper than it was throughout the region because of the pandemic, at least in closed sales. But since then, the increases and the follow-on catch-up growth in DC was also much larger. And so as of September, the year-to-date trends for both the region and the district are exactly the same. Well, a couple, a little sort of tenths of a percentage point different, but not different enough to say that there's been a total shift in demand for how housing functions either here or in DC. And so I suspect that nationally, some of what you're seeing is a difference in timing, and that depending on what you're looking at, that some of the city center areas will actually catch up over time, with the caveat being if there's a change in fundamentals in not just the pandemic, but things like crime or schools or other things that typically affect housing demand. The bigger picture issues remain in our region. We have had almost 15 years of undersupply. Everyone knows this chart. And that has worsened in the pandemic. And as of August, we were down about 17% of our housing permits compared to the same period in 2019. That's about 3,100 permits. It's going to be very difficult to catch this up because of the seasonality with construction, both permitting and construction on the ground build. So that is, we're going to have a worsening undersupply situation for the next few years because of the pandemic and the difficulties associated with building right now. Part of the undersupply story is that it's actually contributing to some of our population patterns, specifically outmigration. If households are unable to find the right housing unit to cycle up to here, and they're able to find a better bundle, jobs, housing, quality of life elsewhere, they'll leave. And I think there's a lot of that going on in this chart. We have now had 6 consecutive years of net domestic outmigration. That's the yellow line at the bottom. As a reminder, what typically happens during recessions is that we lose fewer people because we retain our current resident base better. We are often the risk-averse choice for the safe choice. And so that during recessions, people tend not to move as much. So that is the economic default for the pandemic as well. There may be some differences because of people's perception about safety, but the economic force will be a countervailing force to that. And so I think that we'll probably we will probably still continue to see net domestic outmigration this year. It's actually, I think that we'll have less domestic outmigration than we would in a normal year because of the recession. And so there's there are a large number of people represented in this chart. We tend to have more than 150,000 people move in and out each year. And so it's very easy to find anecdotal evidence of people moving in either direction right now. One of the things that I will point out, I haven't run this out since August, but when you look at the COVID case rates overall per 1,000 residents and compare it to density, I'm using a population weighted density to create a better sort of median density, not just average density. There isn't a relationship, or there wasn't a relationship in August, and I bet that the relationship has even disintegrated since then. Because if you remember in August, the major metros, the most dense metros were the ones that had been affected first. And since then, it's been the secondary and tertiary markets that have had their main waves. Now, I know that this is the perception of safety is going to be driving people's preferences more than these data will. But for people that really examine this, once the pandemic has fully subsided, right now, there isn't very much evidence to suggest that it's specifically density is having an effect on the total case rates. There's a lot more that goes into that. And this is not something that I'm analyzing officially just yet because it's far too early. We are still in the middle of the game. And so we won't know the outcomes until later on. But as of right now, it looks very much like that despite the concerns about it, that the data probably won't support those concerns. Now, looking ahead, our fall and early winter recovery, as I mentioned, is probably going to be very, very slow. The majority of the recovery that we will have this year has probably already happened for a couple of the reasons that I've already talked about, but there's continued uncertainty about a true second wave locally. And even if that doesn't come to fruition, our case rates are still elevated and haven't really moved. So people aren't going to really change their behaviors because there's no impetus to do so. The second major issue is that consumer sentiment took a major hit in more or less in June, July. In June, we thought that everything was, or nationally, things seemed to have gotten quite a lot better, and then that turned out to not be the case. And that's really when the pandemic fatigue set in, and consumers don't just spend how much money they have, they actually spend a little bit how they feel. And so if they feel a little bit uncertain, then they will pull back on their spending. The last reason here in particular is that we have the federal election, and oftentimes prior to the election, we do have a little bit of a stall in some activities. Businesses and households are probably going to postpone some major decisions right now until they know the results, just because there are some policies that could change that would affect how they would want to make those decisions. Going forward in January, there should be a little bit of a bump, but to account for some of that deferred activity from the federal election specific piece. But we won't really see an acceleration in recovery until there's a vaccine, probably in the middle of 2021. And even if there's a vaccine a little bit earlier, this accounts for the really slow uptick in vaccination rates. We don't have the distribution mechanisms to get it out instantaneously, and it's probably going to need to be phased in. The last piece of this is schools. I haven't talked very much about this, but a lot of workers are working from home in part to help manage their children. We have a lot of our worker households have children, and those children are now doing remote schooling for the most part. And until those children are back in school, our workers aren't going to be able to make major changes to their behaviors because kids come first for most of these households, I would assume. And then lastly, the main uptick in recovery that we will likely have will be in the fall in 2022, when there is a second gen vaccine, and a combination of that plus the fact that the first gen vaccine will have had more universal uptake rates. What this means is that in 2020, we will have lost an average of 165-ish thousand jobs through the course of the year. And in 2021, we will add back about 118,000. So that's not all of the jobs that we lost initially. That's only part of them. And that is true for all of the sub-state areas, so that the job bounce in 2021 is not large enough to make up all of the jobs that were lost in 2020. The main bounce comes in 2022, and these jobs are the ones that are sort of the hardest to get, and are the hardest to recover from, and they have higher value adds on the economic side as well. Going into 2023 and 2024, 23 is probably going to be a repositioning year, is how I'm framing it, where we will have been through the pandemic, and we will have had 2 to 3 years of a loss of business plans, a loss of investments, a loss of forward thinking, just general 5-year plans will have been scuttled. And so 2023 is when everyone's going to need to sit back down and go, okay, well, what are we really going to do this year, next year, and the upcoming, sort of take a look at the upcoming revenue streams. So that's going to mean that job growth and economic growth that year are a little bit smaller than in prior years. But in 2024, that repositioning is likely to have happened. And so you see a little bit of a bounce because of that. So you get the benefit of the planning. When measuring based off of economic activity, our overall economy is going to shrink by about 3.3% this year. That's what we're on track to do right now when you look at the jobs and the productivity losses. In 2021, we are likely to have an increase of about 2.4%. That's, again, not enough to make up for the loss that we had in 2020. And the 4.4% increase that we see in 2022 is really what's going to get us to full recovery. And so by the end of 2022, our economy will be larger than what it was in 2019, but it will happen later in the year. 2023 and 2024 are, again, those repositioning years, so you see some minor differences there. And that is all I have. And so I don't know how we are going to handle questions and see if there are any in the chat, or if Lisa, if you want to pop back on and help moderate. I don't know if that's how this has gone in the past.
Yeah. Anyone have a question? Please either type it into the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask.
Could you describe in more detail the natural increase that's happening? I guess that's births over deaths, and whether there are interesting trends in that.
The natural increase, as you say, is births minus deaths, and it's just that growth you can think of as babies and improved healthcare. So we have fewer deaths because people are living longer and are healthier for longer, and babies. And so there's really, frankly, not a whole lot interesting there. The migration patterns are where you have major changes in your workers or in your young adults. And I actually see a question from Mary Jane King in the chat, and she asks, does the growth chart mean that in 2021 we will not be recapturing the jobs lost this year? And the answer is yes. Unfortunately, we will not be able to gain all of those back. And in particular, you can think the leisure and hospitality and some retail won't be fully recovered until people can resume prior behaviors, and some of them won't. I see another question from Susan Kimmel, and she asks about the age demographics. So she notes that there are a growing number of seniors who are probably not part of the workforce, and how will that impact our economy? And that is a spot-on point. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but when you look at the major demographic trends going back to about 1990, the major difference is the number of older adults in our community. And this is driven mostly by baby boomers, but also by silent and greatest generation people that are living longer. And what that means is that when you think about, specifically for housing, when you think about, we used to talk about jobs to housing ratios, or we do transportation ratios like that as well. They're not as valid anymore because a larger share of our infrastructure, and I'm including housing and transportation and water and all of the things, they're actually being used by people that are no longer in the workforce and so don't have a job. And so we actually need more things just to account for that growth. Along those lines, generally speaking, aging population bases lead to slower economic growth. And it also has some fiscal implications as well. Older adults typically use, on average, not always, but often use more state and local government resources compared to younger workers. And so when you have a large growth in your older population, you tend to have more fiscal needs as well. So I see a question from John Coe. Have you parsed the out-migration by age and income? I have not done that in a couple of years, but I can say that when you look at our population growth overall, we are losing 25 to 34-year-olds in absolute terms. We've had losses in that age cohort. And so it's likely that we are having weakness either on the attraction or retention side. It could be a couple of things for our young adults. And the other phenomenon here is that our population growth for 35 to 39s has also fallen off quite a bit, which again suggests that when you look going back to 1980 and 1990, we attracted and retained a really large number of young baby boomers, and they've more or less stayed. Some of them have left, but in general, that pattern was what we assumed was going to happen with millennials, and the oldest millennials in particular. The problem is that that has not happened, and as my guess is that as millennials in particular are cycling into, more than half of them are 30 and up at this point. And so generally they still aspire to own a home. They still want families. They still want all of the same things, at least on net, that baby boomers did. It's just that those options aren't available to them right now here. And so they're leaving for other parts of or they're not coming here, sort of a combination of the two. So I see Avrit, apologies if I'm mispronouncing people's names. Can I explain the housing deficit and jobs projection in the next 5 years? Housing has a longer time frame than jobs do, especially when you're looking at a recession. So if you are referring to the current decrease in jobs, you can ignore that on the housing needs side because we will recover, and this is happening nationally, and we're actually better positioned than other places nationally. But the more structural deficit that we have is, if you remember the permitting chart, we've had 15 years, explicitly 15 years of extremely low permits. So we're coming up on that's where we're going to be feeling that more right now than we did earlier, because it takes about 15 years for housing costs to cycle down, just in broad strokes. And you combine that with the fact that it's not just job growth, it's actually your jobs base, because there's a lot of job turnover that happens. We have a really large jobs base, and so that is creating that pressure point. And so it isn't necessarily just the one-for-one job growth, it's that plus the fact that our population is aging. About 15% of our housing units overall are now occupied by someone that doesn't have, or occupied by households that aren't in the workforce anymore. In 1990, that was only 13%. So you can see how that's having an effect. That's a really large shift. So those are some of the more structural issues that we need to be concerned about beyond just what's happening this year. Now, the next question I see is from New Habits and conducting business remotely and leveraging technology, and how I see the medium and long-term impact on commercial space demand, as well as traffic and telecommuting. That is a very open-ended question, and I'm old enough to remember when the internet was going to let us all work from home forever, and everybody was going to want to do that forever, and that did not come to fruition. And actually, what happened since roughly 2000, which is really when I peg the adoption of the internet, the reverse happened, where the clustering effects actually got stronger since 2000 in spite of the internet. And you would think that the internet would have moderated that quite a lot, just because it could have. What we're kind of forgetting right now is that there are very, very strong economic benefits for clustering, both within cities, but also in your office. If you look at the knowledge spillovers, the training, the indirect knowledge acquisition that happens in an office, it's really hard to quantify that, but the pandemic, I don't think, is going to be strong enough for many businesses to erase that economic gain that you get from being in an office. That said, I think we are definitely going to be moving more towards shift work. And the question is how spaced apart those shifts are. If if businesses are letting workers work from home 2 days a week and make them come in 3 days a week, a lot of our businesses already do that. If you drive in on a Monday or Friday, you know that a lot of people telecommute on those days, and the federal government is actually probably the largest driver of that. If businesses are only going to make people come in once a week or maybe once a quarter, then they are going to shed their office space. And my guess is that there's going to be a size distinction where smaller offices are the ones that are most likely to no longer want permanent office space, and instead they'll just rent space for their weekly or every other week meeting, however they parse it out. But the larger office space, the larger tenants, I am skeptical that they are going to make, at least when we come out of this 2022, 2023, that they're going to make really big decisions. And I focus a lot on training. Training is just extremely difficult to do to begin with, and it's even harder to do if everyone is working from home. Let's see. What am I expecting in terms of business closures and losses in retail and hospitality? And they're astronomical. The public data are not keeping up with what the trends are right now. The business closure data, we typically only actually get once a year, and the private sector estimates on the business closure are astounding, but they're also really noisy. So I'm being very careful about what I think we know right now. We really don't know, but the retail and restaurants and entertainment sectors are likely and have already had very large upticks in business closure rates. The countervailing fact here, though, is that our business application rates are also much larger than they were last year. So it looks like there are people and there is capital that's trying to position itself to take to fill that hole. So do I see market conditions as ripe for converting empty office buildings into affordable housing? That's a question that we've been trying to figure out for easily 5 years, I think. It doesn't pencil. That's what I keep coming. It needs a subsidy in order to make it work. And when you think about the setup of an office, the ceiling heights are lower, the piping, the kitchens, the bathrooms, they're all off. Oftentimes the floor plans are too large too, so there's not enough sunlight for what a residential space would need. So I see maybe a temporary change like the We Live space, but that's explicitly temporary for some office spaces. But on a permanent basis, it's actually still cheaper to tear it down and rebuild. And sometimes that's unless there's either a tax expenditure or a subsidy that goes into it. So I don't think that that's going to be a huge part of our market going forward, in spite of the financial changes on the office side. So I see another question on demand shifts that will have impacts on several sectors of the real estate, including transportation, parking, hotels, restaurants, office. And so given the difficulties of adaptive reuse, will we see demolition and rebuild throughout the market? I think in some places we probably will, but we've been seeing that incrementally as well. I don't know that, and Lisa's chiming in that this is the last question. Sorry, I just took over on the Q&A. We have been moving towards adaptive, when you sort of think to the old zoning rules that compartmentalized uses, we've been moving away from that for probably 20 years now, give or take, depending on what market you're looking at. And that's going to continue. And I think in some ways, the pandemic will accelerate that change in the suburbs more than the city centers or the market, or sort of the, I guess, COGS term is activity centers. Because the pandemic will probably spread out activity a little bit more, at least in the short term, not permanently. So it's going to be a little bit more slightly more satellite offices, a little bit more restaurant and retail closer to home, as opposed to towards your commercial base. And so I think that we will start to see a little bit more adaptive reuse. It's just, it's expensive. And so it's expensive. It takes forever to permit. It takes forever to get approvals. And generally speaking, there's still going to be some community concerns about it that's going to slow it down. So I think that's it. Lisa, you are muted.
Okay, I think this is the part where you would get a huge round of applause, Jeannette. We thank you so much for an excellent, comprehensive presentation and for joining us today. And thanks everyone for joining us. We had about 48 participants, which I think is pretty good for a Zoom call. Our next meeting is November 20th, where we will have Yui Brandis speak on the Place Leadership Project. So we'll learn about place management that afternoon. So Lisa, are we going to try to do the breakout rooms? I've got a 1 o'clock, so I've got to scoot, but
yeah, unless, I mean, Jeannette, did you want to answer that last question about from Jennifer about the data? And then John, I can set up the breakout rooms. If you have to go, that's fine.
okay, great.
That
Thank you.
okay?
So just briefly, the question is density and COVID and whether or not that's going to be a talking point, basically, or if the data will dispel it. I am skeptical because I've been in enough community meetings that I know that sometimes it doesn't matter how true something is, it just matters if it feels true. And so even if there is enough data to definitively show the exact magnitude of the effect of density on COVID or whatever that case may be, whether or not residents care is going to be the main question. And my guess is that the residents will split. If they already don't want density, this is just another reason for not wanting density. But if they're already amenable to changes, then they're going to be more willing to listen to what the effect is. And with that, thank you, everyone. I think I'm gonna also log off. Is that
Jeannette, is it okay to share your slides?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, so
apologies for I mistitled the presentation, so ignore the ULI at the top. It was a typo.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you so much, Jeannette. Terrific information. Not as depressing as I thought. Thank you so much. So I hope people will stay. I'm going to create some breakout rooms, and it will give you an opportunity to chat with others in the meeting on a more intimate basis. So we're going to do that now. And please accept when you get your invitation. Thanks. Hi. Unmute yourselves. There you go.
Okay, I was the only person in my breakout room.
Oh, well, I don't know where everyone went. This
A lot
is
of
just
people
not,
left, because it went close to an hour. Maybe it's even.
yeah. Yeah, okay. Mary Jane's in the other one. I don't know how to change her. Let me go there a second.
There was a button to leave your breakout room, so I went back to the main meeting.
Okay.
How are
How
you?
are you? I'm good.
Good.
I wish people would stay around for this because it's nice to be able to have an opportunity to talk, and especially after that whole data download. That was pretty interesting. It was pretty much what I expected, but she's very good at sort of framing a lot of things.
She was terrific. I really, they are masters of compiling data, but she made sense of it. That's what was so good.
Yeah. Yeah. David, are you there? No, he left. Oh no, he's there.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
He may
Anyway,
have muted himself.
all right. Well, so you keeping busy?
Very much so. Yeah, ridiculously busy. So this is the silver lining part of it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have time to do everything I'm doing.
Yeah, right. That's good. That's
Yeah.
really good.
How about you?
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm just doing whatever I want pretty much.